There is a specific kind of man who never asks permission, who never checks if people approve, who never needs the room to validate his decision before he makes it. And most people misread him completely. They think he is arrogant. They think he is cold. They think he does not care what anyone thinks. But that is not what is happening. What is happening is far more dangerous because the man who never needs validation is not ignoring social feedback. He is operating from a completely different psychological foundation. And that foundation was built in a way most men never experience. Machiavelli understood this 500 years ago. He wrote that the man who needs approval from the crowd will always be controlled by the crowd, that his decisions will never be his own, that he will spend his entire life performing strength instead of building it. And the moment you stop needing validation, everything changes. Shift 1. The decision that built him built. Most men go through life outsourcing their problems. Something breaks, they find someone to fix it. Something fails, they find someone to explain it. There is nothing wrong with that, but men who never need validation made a different decision at some point. Consciously or not, they decided that difficulty was not a signal to retreat. That decision, which looks like stubbornness from the outside, is actually a philosophy. And once that philosophy is internalized, it changes everything. Because the man who solves his own problems builds something most men never build: an internal locus of control. The deeply encoded belief that outcomes are primarily shaped by his own effort and understanding, not by luck, not by what other people decide. That belief changes how he approaches a challenge. It changes how he responds when something does not go his way. It changes his tolerance for ambiguity and his threshold for asking for help. It is not that he does not need other people. It is that he carries a deeply encoded faith in his own capacity to figure things out. And that faith was not given to him. It was built one solved problem at a time. Shift 2. The knowledge that lives below words. When a man who never needs validation makes a decision, something interesting happens. He does not explain it. He does not justify it. He does not walk the room through his reasoning. Because the knowledge he is operating from does not exist in a sentence he can hand you. It was built through repetition, failure, and the specific silence that follows when something finally works. Researchers who study how the body and mind work together call this embodied cognition. The knowledge lives below the level of words. Ask a man with this kind of confidence how he knew something was right, and he will pause. He might say, "It just felt right." He is not being vague. He is reporting accurately. The knowledge does not exist in language. It was built through direct experience. And this is why men who never need validation tend to trust their own perception over received opinion. They have been in situations where the expert was wrong, where the advice did not account for the specific conditions in front of them, where their own judgment was the only thing that got them through. Over time, this becomes a bias toward direct experience. They grow skeptical of people who speak with great confidence about things they have never physically touched. That is not arrogance. That is an epistemology built in the gap between what someone told them and what was actually true. If this is already making sense, hit the like button right now. Shift 3. Where this behavior comes from. Many men who operate this way did not figure it out alone. They learned in the presence of someone else. A father who said almost nothing, but handed over responsibility and waited. A mentor who showed instead of explained. A coach who did not rescue them when things got hard. There was no curriculum, no lesson plan. What was being transmitted was not technical information. It was a relationship to difficulty, a way of being with a problem that did not involve walking away from it. This is why this kind of confidence becomes identity for men. When a skill is learned through a relationship, it carries emotional weight that no tutorial can replicate. The first real problem a man solved on his own is remembered with a specificity that is almost biographical. Not because of the problem itself, but because of who was there, because of what it meant, because of what it proved. And this is where people misread men who operate this way. They see the self-sufficiency and assume it is about not wanting help. They see the quiet confidence and read it as coldness. But underneath, something else is operating. The man who never needs validation learned early that problems yield to patience, that the world responds to careful attention, that mastery is available to anyone willing to stay with difficulty long enough. And once that lesson is internalized, the need for external approval starts to dissolve. Shift 4. The psychological reset. Working on something real is one of the last remaining contexts in which a man can be completely, verifiably right. In most areas of modern life, success is ambiguous. Did the meeting go well? Hard to say. Was the decision correct? Depends who you ask. But something that was not working and now is, that is not a matter of interpretation. The feedback is absolute. For men who spend most of their time in environments of subjective evaluation and uncertain outcome, that kind of clarity is not just satisfying, it is stabilizing. This is why a man who is overwhelmed does not always talk about it. He works on something. He finds a bounded problem with a knowable solution. He rebuilds, in miniature, the experience of competence and control that the rest of the week may have taken from him. What looks like a coping mechanism is actually a psychological reset. What looks like avoiding the problem is actually restoring the part of himself that can face it. And the man who has access to that reset no longer needs constant validation from the people around him, because he has something more reliable, a direct relationship with reality. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what is coming next is the most dangerous part. Shift 5. Why this terrifies people. Here is what most people will not admit. The man who does not need validation is terrifying to people who do. Because he cannot be controlled through social pressure. He cannot be manipulated through approval or rejection. He cannot be threatened with exclusion because he already knows he can operate alone. And that makes him dangerous. Not physically dangerous, strategically dangerous. Machiavelli wrote about this. He observed that men who require the approval of the crowd will always be at the mercy of the crowd, that their decisions will be filtered through fear of disapproval, that they will spend their entire lives performing confidence instead of building it. But the man who has built real competence, who has solved real problems, who has experienced the specific clarity that comes from getting something right through his own effort, that man does not perform. He does not need to. And people sense that. They sense that he is operating from a different foundation. They sense that the usual levers do not work on him. And some people resent him for it. Because his self-sufficiency is a mirror. It reflects back their own dependence. Shift 6. The loneliness no one talks about. But there is a cost. The man who never needs validation often ends up isolated in a way that is hard to explain. Not because he pushes people away, but because most relationships are built on reciprocal vulnerability, on needing each other, on asking for help and being asked for help in return. And when a man has trained himself not to need validation, not to need approval, not to need reassurance, He accidentally trains himself out of the very behaviors that build connection. This is the trap most men with this mindset fall into. They mistake independence for strength. They mistake self-sufficiency for maturity. But at some point, the man who never needs anything becomes the man who never receives anything. And that isolation compounds. Because the more competent he becomes, the less he thinks to reach out. The more problems he solves alone, the more he reinforces the belief that reaching out is unnecessary. Until one day he realizes he has built a life where no one really knows him, where people respect him, admire him, even fear him, but no one is close to him. And by then, the pattern is so deeply encoded that breaking it feels like breaking himself. Shift 7. The decision point. So, here's the question. Where did you learn that needing people was weakness? Because that is the belief underneath all of this. That is the invisible architecture. And if you trace it back far enough, you will find a moment. A time when you asked for help and were disappointed. A time when you were vulnerable and it was used against you. A time when you needed validation and it was withheld. And in that moment, you made a decision. You decided you would never need it again. And that decision protected you. It made you stronger. It made you self-sufficient. But it also isolated you. Because the thing about validation is this: you do not need it to survive, but you need it to connect. The man who never needs validation has mastered survival. But he has not yet mastered connection. And that is the final shift. Realizing that not needing people and not letting people in are two different things. You can be self-sufficient and still be connected. You can be independent and still be vulnerable. You can solve your own problems and still let people know when you are struggling. The question is not whether you need validation. The question is whether you have any space in your life where you let people see you as you actually are. Because the men who rise are not the ones who never need anyone. They are the ones who know when to be self-sufficient and when to be human. If this hit you differently than you expected, do not stop here. Hit the subscribe button because the next video goes even deeper into the psychology of men who operate alone. And leave a comment. What is the hardest part of not needing validation? I read every single one.